There's so many things going on in the world today, and people are passionate about seeing change. Well, Jesus has the answer for that, but we have to first ask ourselves, is there not a cause? Hello everybody, this is Pastor Lyle and welcome to Daily Renewal. If you're new to our channel, I just want to encourage you to consider becoming a subscriber to our channel, hitting that like button and ringing that bell below, and that will enable you to have access to over 100 different episodes of Daily Renewal that are all designed to help you in your walk with God. You know, if it's one thing that's really important to people, in this day and age, it's finding out what your purpose is or lining up with a cause. You know, we look at all of these different movies on TV, and what makes a great story is that there's a cause that people bite into, that they're willing to fight for, in some cases to the death. And, you know, it's no different when we look at our own lives. You know, we are looking for purpose, we're looking for a cause. You know, when I look back at the Bible, one of the stories that absolutely has had an impact on my life over the years was the story of David and Goliath. And, you know, that story, when we look at it, it's a story, you know, when I look at sports, for example, you know, I've been involved with sports, but even before I was a Christian, I knew, you know, there was the expression of, you know, the great victory of David versus Goliath. And usually it's some sports team that had no chance beating some juggernaut that there was no way they could be beaten. You know, I look back at one of the stories in history, and a hockey story that most Americans claim is the greatest story about hockey that's ever been written. And it was The Miracle on Ice. And there's been movies made about it. It was about the American hockey team in 1980 that was made up of primarily a bunch of college kids, and they were coming up against a Russian team that were professionals. Now, these professionals had actually played a series against NHL professionals that year, and the year earlier, I think it was, in '79, in the Challenge Cup, and they had thumped the NHL professionals badly. So now they're coming up against a U.S. squad that they actually faced in exhibition games, and they actually beat them. Let me make sure of this. I think it was 10-3. They absolutely annihilated them. Well, the U.S. team basically had no chance. Like I said, they had got demolished by this Russian team in exhibition games, and the coach of the Russian team later said that was actually part of their undoing, is they were very complacent coming up against this U.S. team because they had beat them so badly. Well, we all know the story. If you're a hockey fan at all, you know the story of Jim Craig, the goalie, and all these college kids that somehow performed a miracle. They were the David to up against the Goliath that was impossible to beat. Now, as we look at that story, as amazing as it sounds, there wasn't nearly as much at stake as the original story. And I want to share with you a little bit about that story, and we're going to take a look at how today the idea of how our purpose really needs to be evaluated based on this story. So let's take a look. In 1 Samuel, we see that up to this point, we see that the children of Israel are lined up on the battle lines against the Philistines. And there was a lot at stake. It wasn't just a title. It wasn't just saying, we're better than you. No, they were actually lined up, and the Philistines were defying them, saying, you bring out your best guy to fight our best guy, and whoever wins, the entire nation is going to become servants of the other nation. And so they would send out Goliath. And Goliath was huge compared to anybody that the Israelites had. In fact, I mean, he was a giant among all the men that were there. He was very intimidating. And he would come out night and day for 40 days and defy them and say, you bring out your best, and whoever wins, your nation or our nation, whoever wins, that other nation is going to have to submit and be servants to them. Well, David hadn't been a part of any of this. He was just a boy, and his brothers were a part of the army. And, remember that they were the army of God. And somewhere along the line, they had lost track of what this was all about. They had lost track that they were the army of God. And we see that David was able to understand that there was a bigger purpose here than just going up against some guy that looked like he was unbeatable. So David comes into the camp just to see his brothers, and his brothers are actually upset with him. But there was talk about what was going on, and the king, Saul at the time, was actually offering all of this stuff if somebody would just go out there and beat this guy. And so we pick it up in verse 25, again, of 1 Samuel 17. It says this: "So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter and give him his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel.' And then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?' And the people answered him in this manner, saying, 'So shall it be for the man who kills him.' Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, 'Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.' And David said, 'What have I done now? Is there not a cause?'" Very interestingly, and when we look at the idea of taking up a cause, it's often that we see that there's a lot of people that really don't understand, what they don't see what we're seeing. I look at a lot of the causes that we have today, and there's a lot of things that we can see that have been brought up that are some would say worthy causes, some causes not so worthy. But the idea of seeing that there's something that needs to be done. There's so many of these ideas that people are grabbing a hold of, and today this is what I want to talk to you about. How do we know that the cause that we have is really a just cause? Because with David, we can see here that he was able to see beyond just winning a fight, beyond just seeing the odds. He understood and was able to take up the fact that God had a cause in this thing. This was more about God winning a victory than it was him. He saw that there was somebody that was coming out to defy God. And David believed that, anybody could come up in the name of God and get this victory. You have to see beyond the natural in order to get this. And David was able to rise up, and we know the story. He was able to overcome unsurmountable odds in the natural. And now we read a story that is often looked at and referred to when the impossible is made possible through somebody who was willing to take up a cause. So let's look at some of the causes today. When I look at my Facebook feed or I read the news, I see that there's many causes today. Some of the causes we see, there's many people that are standing up for the rights of trans people. There's people that are standing up for social justices or climate change. When we look at politics, there's people that are taking a stand, and the idea of whether we should ban guns or whether you should be able to have guns has become a political issue. Even the topic of abortion. Are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? There's people taking a stand today on social distancing, or whether we should wear a mask, or whether we should be allowed to open businesses back up. And on either side, there's people that think that either one of these things they've taken up as their cause. We've got people that talk about vaccines, whether we should take vaccines. I've seen people get in terrible arguments on the fact that, you're causing people to be in danger if you don't vaccinate your kids. And there's others that say you'll be in danger if you do vaccinate. We see even in the news lately the idea of racism in the news. We see a man that ran into some what appears to be an injustice by police officers, and there's a lot of outcry towards injustices against certain races by police officers. We see a lot of people that, even as I'm doing this video right now, there's people rioting because a man named George Floyd was in a position where he died as a result of something that a police officer had done to him. We can go to the church, and one of the big things that's being talked about right now, and I even talked a little bit about this on my last week's episode or Sunday edition of Daily Renewal. The church, the church is looking at and fighting against this idea of the government saying that we can't meet, or you can only meet with certain amount of people, and there's a lot of people in church that are saying no. We should be allowed to meet with as many people as we want because we have the right to do this according to the laws that are put into place by the founding fathers. There's a lot of arguments over these things. Now, you can argue on which side of any of these particular causes that you want to believe in. But one thing that I want to observe today that we need to take a look at is a lot of these causes are coming to the point where they're causing huge divisions between people. It's getting to the point where people are actually wondering what you think about a lot of these things. And if they find out that your cause or what you believe about the thing that they're passionate about, if you don't agree with them, it can get to the point where even family members don't talk anymore. I think we really need to be very careful and analyze some of these causes. I've seen people that have absolutely been shunned because they didn't either agree or they weren't willing to be as passionate about somebody's cause. Well, that brings me to the topic that I really want to get to today. How do we know that the cause that we have picked up is really the cause that God is involved with? Well, in order to answer this question, we can look and say, well, Jesus is for social justice. He doesn't want to see people marginalized. Jesus doesn't like to see people murdered. I mean, these are all true things. But I think it's very important that we pinpoint what really is the thing that Jesus has made his cause. Because if we're going to, at the end, really accomplish everything that God has for us, we're going to have to submit ourselves to what Jesus really wants. If you're a God-fearing person, if you call yourself a believer, then we have to not pick up our own cause, but we have to get involved in what exactly is Jesus' cause. So let's talk about that today. If you go with me to Matthew, the book of Matthew, chapter 16, we see here that Jesus, he's been performing miracles, he's been speaking to people, but up to this point, he really hasn't let everybody know why he's here. And this is one of the key turning points in the New Testament, I believe, that often is overlooked. And that is when Jesus reveals to his disciples his entire reason for coming. And, we see here in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 13, it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? So they said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Now this is really important because he's talking to his close-knit group of people. And they've been traveling with him, and they're at the point where he's going, okay, I want to see if these guys are really coming to understand who I am. And so it's an important question, a litmus test to find out where they're at. And Simon Peter answered and said, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." In other words, regular circumstances have not revealed this to you. The fact that I am the Son of God, I am God manifest in the flesh. And he says, "And I also say to you that you are Peter. And on this rock," and I've talked about this in Daily Renewal on many occasions, on this rock, what does this mean? Upon this revelation of who I am, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So I want to paint the picture here. Jesus has got his closest group together, and he says, "Who do you guys say that I am? Do you understand who I am? And if you understand who I am, you will understand why I came." And Peter says, "Well, yeah, you're the Son of the living God." And immediately, Jesus capitalizes on that, and he goes, excellent. Somebody understands this. And now that there's somebody on earth that understands this, that I came, I am upon the revelation that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. Because of that, because there's somebody that has grasped that, I can now do what I came to do. And what was that? Build my church so that I can come against the gates of hell, and the gates of hell will not prevail against us. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. The idea of building his church. Well, if you're a believer and you still believe that the church is the building that we meet at, then let me help you. No, the church is those who have a revelation of who Jesus is, why he came, and the role that that plays in our life, not just here on earth, but how he came so that we could be reconciled to the Father because we were separate from him, so that we could spend eternity with him. So the idea of him building his church is the idea that he came to build up his people, the people that call upon his name, so that they would be those that would walk with him, and those that chose to walk with him became a mighty force, engaged in an army, if you will, a spiritual army that would come against the darkness of this world, that would come against his spiritual opposition, which is Satan and all his forces that have an amount of rule and reign here on earth. That church that he is building will come against the gates of hell, and the gates of hell at one point in time will be defeated by the Lord and his church. So when we see what Jesus was putting into play here in talking about Peter's revelation, he's saying, okay, upon this revelation, the church needs to understand that there is a bigger game at play here, that everything that has happened before the existence of man, the idea of good versus evil, the idea of God versus Satan, is now reached a new dimension. Now that the church has come into play, now we're about to see that the idea of the church, there's a bigger purpose here than us just gathering together, singing some songs and listening to a guy preach for half an hour. No, the idea of the church is that there's a battle that's going on here. And when people have come to the revelation of why Jesus came, and we in turn choose to enlist in the plan and purpose of why Jesus came, then we get to see and be a part of a purpose that has eternal benefits. So I want to take a look at today a little bit at analyzing, are our causes a cause that God is truly happy with? You know, as I mentioned earlier, we can be passionate about a lot of things and we can have good intent, but ultimately, if we have any cause that rises above the cause that Jesus has as a believer, the cause of seeing his church built to the point where the gates of hell are stormed, where we come against the gates of hell and have victory over those things. If any cause is above that, then we're in trouble. And let me clarify that. You know, there's a lot of causes that do line up with the Bible. I'll give you one for example. A cause that I believe in. I'm pro-life, for example. I don't believe in the fact that God thinks it's a good idea to kill babies in their womb. That's how I'll refer to it. And if somebody doesn't like that, again, I'm sorry that you don't like that opinion, but I'm pro-life. But I can tell you this, as pro-life as I am, I've seen people who will take up the cause of pro-life to the point where it's their number one cause. In other words, everything in their life is geared towards making sure that they're protesting, that they're posting Facebook posts, that they're getting the information out. And I've seen some that have made a transition to the point where they're focused so much on that particular issue that it's become number one. And the idea of actually rescuing people from eternal damnation has become second, third, or further down on the list than it was ever intended to be. I'll give you an example of how that's a problem. Let's just say, for example, that you do all your protesting, you do all of the things that you need to do, and I'm not putting those things down. We do need to get the information out. But let's say that you did enough to actually save somebody, save a child from being aborted. A mom makes a decision not to abort a child, and that child is born and ends up living a great life. But as much as they live a great life, they've never they come to the end of their life and they never hear the gospel, and therefore they never become a Christian, and they still spend eternity separate from God. Let me ask you, when you look back, which one of those causes was more important? The stand we took on pro-life, or the stand we took to be able to preach the gospel to somebody and see somebody become a part of the church of the living God? See, ultimately, this isn't about just having a life living here on earth. This is about our eternity. So as much as I am pro-life, and I agree that we need to stand up for those things, we have to be careful that the cause we choose doesn't supersede the cause, which is seeing somebody rescued from eternal damnation. Somebody that Jesus himself has died for, so that they would come to the point where they are reunited eternally with God. So, I look back, I remember when I first started in street ministry. That was where I was at. I worked with street people, and I was sent to a conference, and I was actually in a room with a guy from a church movement, and it had deep roots. And I remember he unfolded this map, and in tears he said, my church movement has lost track of what this is all about. He says, when we started, it was about a man or woman coming to know Christ. And it was a picture of a man being pulled out of a lake by another person. Somebody that was drowning, and somebody spent the time to pull them out of the lake. And it showed that man pulling him out of a lake and walking him to another building where he cleaned him up. And then from there, after he was cleaned up, he walked him to another building where he was taught the things of God. And from after there, he walked him to another building where he was taught how to pull other people out of the lake. And then the next picture showed them walking to the lake, and then the last picture ended with both of them pulling another person that was in the same position as the first. They were both pulling somebody that was drowning out of the lake. For us as believers, we have to really come to understand that all of this is about developing our relationship with Jesus. Yes, our individual walk with God. But from there, we have to have an absolute concern with seeing Jesus' church built. yes, us growing individually, spiritually, but helping others come to know Jesus and having a passion to bring people out of the lake, to pull other people out of the lake. This isn't just about me becoming some kind of a spiritual giant so that I can be more accepted by Jesus. You know, God loves me just as much now as he did before I ever made a commitment to him. You know, when I was yet a sinner, Jesus chose to die on a cross for me. He doesn't love me any more or any less than he did that day. But from there, as I walk with Jesus, I begin to love the things that he loves. And I begin to despise the things that he despises. And the thing that Jesus loved the most, the thing that, as we see here, the whole reason he came was to build his church so that he could defeat the powers of darkness. He gives us opportunity to be involved in this victory over darkness by becoming part of what he calls his church, those who are devoted to him. So from there, that devotion should spur us onward to make his cause our cause. And our cause is to, yes, develop spiritually, but also to help rescue those who are in the lake drowning. We've got to be have our eyes set upon seeing his church develop. So that brings me to the question today. How do we oppose culture to bring change? You know, when we look at all of these different scenarios of what people are willing to stand up for, what they're saying is, I want to come against what I perceive the culture to be saying, and I want to be a catalyst for change. How do we oppose culture to bring change? Now, as simple as it may sound, I've come to understand if we really want to oppose culture or affect culture to truly bring change, it's not going to be by us taking a stand to make sure they don't take our guns. Now, should we take that stand to a degree? Yeah, absolutely. If you believe that that's a stand that we can biblically look at, defend yourself, that's fine. Does it come to, we need to take a stand and make sure that the government doesn't take away our charitable giving for churches, because it's our right to be able to get that. Is there anything wrong with taking that stand? You can. If you're a churchgoer, the idea of meeting together, which again, I mentioned even on my last week's broadcast, the idea of it's our right to be able to meet together. Do we want to take a stand on that? You can if you want, but I'm going to tell you that all of those things better be second place to this number one thing that you have to keep in mind. If you really do want to stand for something that is going to transform the culture, that's taking a stand for God, here it is. I'll capsulate it and I'll make it easy for you. If you're going to absolutely be somebody that's going to make a difference, you need to do this. And what is it? You need to, wait for it, you need to be a Christian. Well, that sounds simple enough. I'm already a Christian. Pastor Lyle, there's got to be more to it than that. No, I'm going to say I'm talking about really being a Christian. The idea of being a Christian, is actually a real foreign to a lot of people when we look at it biblically. What does that mean? What does being a Christian mean? Well, let's continue looking in Matthew 16. We don't have to go very much further. It talks about this in verse 24. It says, Jesus says to his disciples, he says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Denying yourself is one of the key principles of actually being a Christian. And the problem with that is when we look at a lot of the causes that we have, often when we really do analysis on it, and I ask you to do this, ask yourself, why am I standing for what I'm standing for? Is it because of my rights? Is it because of what I believe? Or is it something really that God has set in stone that we need to stand for? I'll give you an example, and I used it last week, but I'm going to use it again. This idea of our rights to be able to meet together, and churches are fighting this. I know churches that are writing to the government and saying, hey, we should be allowed. We got our big buildings. We should be allowed to meet at capacity, some churches say, or social distance. And I find it amazing. In some of these cases, they're making it really tough to be able to meet in congregational settings the way the churches have met for years in North America. But I'm going to tell you this, that if we really believe that the idea for us to be able to meet in large gatherings like we've always met is us standing up for our rights, and it's something we need to stand for, and we put that above actually standing for Jesus, or we say, well, it is standing for Jesus, then how do we look at the church in China? How do we look at the church in Korea and all around the world? One of the things that I've said often, in our church, we've tried to focus on our brothers and sisters around the world that have already been in heavy persecution, and the idea of their right to be able to assemble. I've heard people say that if you don't fight for your right to be able to assemble, you're biting into the thoughts of the devil, or you're biting into the number of the beast system. You're biting into the devil's system. Well, so are these churches biting into the devil's system? These churches where their government has said it's illegal to meet? They still meet. They still find ways to do the principles of God that we see even listed in Acts 2, the idea of continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. If there's a time where the government makes it absolutely illegal to meet, we have to make decisions on how to meet. In the early church, we saw that there was times where they were persecuted and they still found ways to meet. But for us to say, I'm fighting for the right to meet in my large gathering so I can do it the way we've always done it, I think that there's a portion of that where God is saying, hey, he's trying to wake us up, because statistically, when you look at a lot of people on why they go to church and why they attend church services, I think we have to even analyze our motives on why we do that. There's a lot of people that really think that, the idea of me going to church even twice a year at Christmas and Easter, God's happy with me as long as I do those two things. We send a lot of mixed messages by making a church service on Sunday where we all get together and do the things that we're accustomed to doing, that's our right and that's what God wants for us. Well, no, I'll tell you what God wants for you. He wants for you to learn how to walk with Him. He wants for you to get to the point where you're so passionate about God that you're not dependent on that church service, but that you know how to walk with God in such a way where you have a passion to go tell other people about Jesus. I'll tell you another reason why I think that this is kind of strange. When we look at the idea of having a church service on Sunday and we want to fill a building with 200 people, if we really we look at the idea of us meeting together important as far as something that God's called us to do, then why don't we look at this as, we're allowed to meet, so why don't we have 6 or 7 services with a smaller amount of people? What's wrong with that? I think we pick up some of these fights not understanding that potentially by us picking the fight that we're fighting, we could potentially, and as I mentioned this last week, we could be potentially turning off some of the people that we're actually trying to reach just by us taking up the mantle or taking up the fight that really is not a fight that's God's fight. God still manages to, all through church history, still managed to find ways for believers to meet together and do what we were really called to do, and that's develop as a believer and help others develop as believers. How that's done is not written in stone. Jesus is really clear here. He says, if you really want to come after me, you're going to have to deny yourself. And for a lot of us, we've lived in real comfort in North America when it comes to Christianity. The comfort, the benefits that we've been allowed for years, when some of those are taken away, we have to understand that these things have just been comforts that we've had. The idea of denying ourselves and taking up our cross, which is an indication that there's going to be things that are not going to be easy. We're not going to agree with a lot of the things that the world says we can or can't do. But you think that they didn't deal with that in the early church time or all through church history? They did. You think of the time that Jesus was there. The Jews weren't in power at that time. Even Peter, and take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter puts it this way in verse 11. He says, "Beloved, I beg of you, as sojourners and pilgrims," and that's also translated as foreigners or exiles, or temporary residents. We are temporary residents here. If you're a believer, we're not of this world. We're here for a short amount of time. And he says, as foreigners or exiles. In other words, Peter's talking about a time where, hey, here we are. We're in a place where we have to understand there's opposition. We're not in charge here. And he says, "Beloved, I beg of you, as sojourners or pilgrims or as foreigners or exiles," he says, "abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." Well, let's take a look at this. He says, "Beloved, I beg of you." We've got to look at this. He says, understand that as us being the ones that aren't in charge here, and this is a problem because there's a lot of things being preached today that, as Christians, we need to get to the point where it's preached almost like there's and there's movements. I'm not going to exactly name them, but I'm going to tell you, if you go to a church that tells you that you need to just take a stand and all of the believers, we're going to get all the government positions and we're going to get all the positions of power, and then when that happens, Jesus is going to come back and we're going to polish up the throne and he can just sit down and he's going to rule and reign. That is not biblical. In fact, it's very clear that in the last days, Christianity is going to come under fire. There is going to be a huge persecution upon the church. And if all of the Christians are going to be in all the power positions, how is that going to happen? Check your doctrine. If your church is preaching stuff like this, then I'm going to tell you, you need to be very careful. Because when the huge persecution does come, like we're beginning to see, there's going to be a lot of things come into your thinking that you're going to go, well, hold it. I thought it was supposed to go another way. And what's going to happen is because of that, there's going to be potential doubt that's going to seep in, and that's going to cause a problem. See, so we get back to what he says here, what Peter says. He says, "Beloved, I beg you, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your soul." In other words, abstain from these things, these worldly things, these things that we look at on the outside that we think are important. Abstain from them. Abstain from these fleshly lusts that war against your soul, or war against your mind, your will, and your emotions. In other words, we have to be very careful of the things that war against our thinking. Our thinking has to line up with the Bible. Things that war against our will, or those things that we desire not to do, or when we look at our desires, our will, what is it that's coming against us that we just don't like? We have to check it towards whether it lines up with God's will or our will. With any one of these things that we look at, these causes we take up, we really have to analyze: is it something that Jesus really looks at as being important? Because our will go accordingly. And emotions. How are we being affected by some of these things that are happening? And again, we get passionate about some of these things. And I'm not saying don't be passionate, but we have to look, and if some of these causes we're taking up just because how it affects our comfort level or affects things that are happening to us outwardly, We have to have our eyes heavenly minded. And again, if we are heavenly minded, we are going to be focused on, again, our relationship with Jesus and helping others come to know Jesus. So development, and I'll use the term evangelism, helping others come to know Christ and to be developed in Christ as well. It says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. This is key. That when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Now, this is why I said the idea, if you really want to bring change to your culture, they've got to see a transformation in your life. And that's why I say it's as simple as this. Be a Christian. Now, let me clarify that. Not just do Christian things. Not just go to church. Not just make sure that you make adjustments to your behavior. No. This is all about our absolute devotion to God. That, there's times in your life where you're going to miss the mark. There's times where sin comes in. There's times where maybe you've bit into a cause that is not really a God cause, or you bit into a cause and you've set that cause above what Jesus' cause is. When we do that, then we have the choice to readjust. God gives us the grace to come back to the original cause, to set ourselves right, and truly walk with God in a Christ-centered manner, making Jesus the center of everything we do, everything we think, everything that we're about. Not our cause, but Him and His cause. Again, so it says, having our conduct honorable. When we allow God to work in our lives, when our eyes are set upon Him, He changes our conduct. We change from the inside. We are a new creation when we are born again. And from there, the way we do things, the way we think begins to change, and it affects our actions, which in turn affects our conduct. We will walk with honorable conduct when our main focus is Christ and His kingdom, or Jesus and His church. So, as this begin to happen, the Gentiles, or people that don't know God, they will see that, and even when they speak of you as an evildoer, hey, we're going to be spoke as evil. There's things happening in our culture that are anti-God, and it's going to continue happening. All through our school system, all through our cultures, we have to understand that there's an enemy that is also sifting through our culture and creating an anti-God sentiment. So there's a lot of thinking that's anti-God. So there's a lot of people that are going to look at, and do look at, believers, those who walk with Jesus, and they see it as being wrong. They see it as being evil. And so Peter's talking about this here. He says, you know what? He says, when people speak of you as evildoers, they're going to see your good works. In other words, they're going to see something about you. Even though they might think you're evil, there's going to be something they see about you because of your lifestyle, because of your focus. There's going to be something different, because if you're walking with God, you're going to have good works. There's going to be things, there's going to be good coming out of you. There was people that were diametrically opposed to Jesus, and yet they couldn't deny the things that He did were actually bringing hope, bringing peace, bringing life to people. It was really hard to come against Him, and yet often they did. Jesus was a controversial figure, and He still is today. There's people who would come against Him because they saw Him as a threat, and they still see Him as a threat today. And they may see you as a threat. If you walk with the Lord, there will be people that see you as a threat. But Peter says here, let your good works which they observe glorify God. Cause them to glorify God in the day of visitation. Understand that when your focus, when your cause is God's cause, when you can see that you are here because there is a lost and dying world, that Jesus came, He died, He shed His blood on the cross for, He was willing to go through more pain than anybody's ever experienced here. Why? For you and I, so that we could be reconciled to God. When we understand that He now gives us the opportunity to bring the message of the gospel. And I've heard people minimize that message and say, well, oh, it's worth, the whole message of God is more about just the gospel. It's more than that. It's because when people come against that, say, oh, they minimize the idea of the gospel, it's because they truly don't understand the power and the message of the gospel. Well, God wants you to have power here on earth. God wants you to have this, and God wants you to be, kings and priests. Yeah, but a lot of those things are taken out of context. Without us having a real revelation of what the gospel is, what the gospel does, and now we are ambassadors of the gospel. We're the ones who now are empowered by God's grace to bring that message so that it would rescue people from eternal damnation. If we haven't got that as our focus, then everything else means nothing. You can tell people, when I worked in a street ministry, like I mentioned, I talk about this often. We fed people. Was it important to feed people? Jesus says, we need to treat the poor in certain ways. We need to help the poor. He also says, the poor you will have with you always. I've seen entire church movements that have focused on the poor. They make sure they help them. They give them coats. They give them blankets. They give them food. But if a church or if a mission, if somebody gives people food, they help them here on this earth. If you don't want to give somebody the gospel, then you have missed the entire purpose of why we're even here. Helping somebody in the temporal way is really shortchanging everything Jesus came to do. Again, that's a great example. Should we help the poor? We need to stand for the poor. Yeah, we'll stand for the poor, but if the poor die in their sins, have we really helped them? No, we've prolonged their time here on earth. But we haven't really helped somebody if we're not willing to get to the point where God can use us to bring the gospel to a lost and dying world. There's so many people that are looking for hope. And we just tell them, hey, if you come to my church, you're going to find hope. I'm going to tell you right now, there's a lot of people that have found their way to a church building that never did find hope. They're still depressed. That are still looking for answers. Our answers are not found in a lot of the movements we take a stand for. Our answers, our true thing that we need to take a stand for is Jesus' plan, what Jesus is passionate about. And Jesus' passion was his church, which means that we need to be passionate about preaching the gospel to those that are lost. And whatever it takes to do that, and without, we're supposed to a large degree, as long as it's not violating the scripture, we're supposed to submit to a lot of the things of the government. We're supposed to do it, try to live in peace with those things. If we can preach the gospel and still come in submission to the laws of the land, all those things, we need to do it. We spend too much time trying to fight those things, and we lose track about what our focus is supposed to be. So I want to challenge you today. Take a look at what you're fighting for. Is what you're fighting for really the real fight? Have we lost track? Have you made the real fight the number 2 or number 3 on your list? Have you put your ideas and what you're fighting for above what Jesus vision, Jesus goal, what Jesus fought for? Have we put that ahead? Have we put our goals ahead of his? And if we have, it's as simple as this. And I like speaking to pastors about this, and a lot of the thinking I have on these topics is because I've done church for a long time, and I myself have gotten sidetracked at times. I've gotten caught up in making sure that the church services are all running real well, and that everything's a well-oiled machine. And I've seen many people fall away from the faith who have gone to what looks like a really hopping church, and yet they've fallen away and lost their first love because they have forgotten why we're here. We're here. Again, if you haven't got this, we're here to love God with everything that we have, and we're here to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you truly love your neighbor, you will be concerned about getting the message of the gospel out to everybody that will hear it. And even, and there's going to be lots that won't. But our passion, everything in us, has to be about getting that message to people. Well, I hope you got something out of that today. If you did, I just want to encourage you again to consider becoming a subscriber to our channel. Feel free to make comments. That helps us. Also, feel free to share these videos with as many people as you can if you think they're going to help people. That's why I do them. Also, we're on Facebook. We do different videos during the week on Facebook as well, some shorter ones. And I'm also going to be, I'm looking at doing a series on helping those people who are maybe new to the faith so you can understand some of the basic spiritual principles. Because I just don't want to assume that everybody knows those things. So look out for those. You can like us on Facebook, our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter and Instagram as well. I am looking forward to our next episode of Daily Renewal. But until then, God bless you and have a great day.